Okay, so the research paper I wanted to do a video on is called expression it's called a Cymbranoid from tobacco prevents the expression of nicotine induced withdrawal behaviors in planarian worms, which I thought was very interesting to look up. Because when we think of addiction, that's what my group is focused on. When you think of addiction, a lot of people measure addiction based on withdrawal. Okay, so what they decided to do was they had multiple controls, which I think was very key to their experiment. And they also had multiple independent variables as well, which I think was also key. So for controls, they would have the planarians not on any type of chemicals throughout the entire experiment, which is one control. Another control would have just received the Cymbranoid or the carbamazepine the entire experiment. So they would receive that one. That way you can compare without it, with it, the entire experiment. And also another group is you get the worms addicted to nicotine. And then after you get them addicted to nicotine, you would see, after you get them addicted to nicotine, they would go through their normal withdrawal, and they would measure them in increments of 0 to 5, 30 to 35, and then 60 to 65. So a little over an hour later. And so they're measuring motility in each of those. So, and then that is how they're going to determine the withdrawal effects. And then they're going to have then after they've determined that, during the withdrawal, they're actually going to give Cymbranoid to another nicotine group. So they the planarian worms would have gotten nicotine. And then during the withdrawal, they would have received Cymbranoid to see if that had an effect on the withdrawal symptoms of nicotine, which they could easily compare to just the solely nicotine group and the withdrawal from that. And they can also compare from just the solely Cymbranoid, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, group as well. And the Cymbranoid group actually showed to have hardly no withdrawal symptoms from it. Obviously, the nicotine group did have a lot of withdrawal, and they're going to measure that in basically in the worm's motility. And now they're going to have different classifications for their motility measurements. Let's see what they would call it. So basically, there's a lot of there seems to be a standard use of how to measure planarian motility. So planarian locomotive behavior is kind of what they're focused on. And it seemed to be one of the ways to measure planarian motility was measured by counting how many times the worm crossed a square per minute over a period of 8 minutes. And you would only use each worm once. That's one way to measure motility. And then the withdrawal-like behavior movements could be described. In this experiment, they used the works of Rafa and Desi from 2005, and they would describe movements such as head bob, the head swinging, blending of the tail to tip, which was known as a tail twist, corkscrew, spiral rotation while floating, swimming, squirming, shaking, clinging. And then the information was graphed of the number of events as a function of time. So some interesting things that came out of it is the presence of the Cymbranoid decreased the motility inhibition of nicotine, which I think was kind of interesting to show. Let's see. But yeah, so I thought this was a very interesting study to do. It does a great job of understanding the methods of it. Also, it starts to study how cannabinoids can be beneficial on reducing withdrawal like behaviors for those who are addicted to nicotine. Which is a great so that is a great way to further research from planarians to those who are already addicted to nicotine. There are some limitations to this. The strengths are definitely the methods, I think. Having multiple control groups, I think having very nice measures, I think being able to articulate those in a very systematic way was definitely some of the strengths in this. So I really did like that. Also, I will say some of the limitations are these are planarian worms and they're not people. And this did just focus on nicotine, but this does not necessarily focus on all addiction or other substance drugs that may not cause addiction. So I will say this is limited in the fact that it can only be applied to worms and maybe not to people, but it is a great stepping stone into furthering research that actually could help us to decrease withdrawal effects rather than focusing solely on the addiction, but maybe lessening the harsh effects of nicotine. And that's interesting in itself. I would actually like to see this go further. And maybe I would like to see this go further into seeing other different known I'd like to see this go further of other different known other supposedly withdrawal with other drugs such as opioids, or I would love to see what methadone does to these worms. I'm also a little hesitant since the worms do